Hello, class. Today we're going to be working on perceiving and analyzing artworks. We know that our individual awareness of our world influences, what we choose as far as aesthetic things. And when I say aesthetics, I mean everything that we see, taste, that we can feel, that we can sense, right, through our senses, and that we choose to live with. So, some of those aesthetic things include fashion, uh, it includes the music we listen to. Even some people can choose where they live or what house they want to live in or what conditions they want to live in. The choices of food, we get to choose the cars we drive, or at least your parents do, and what we deem to be beautiful, right? We get to choose those things. Some people say, like, oh, this is cool, or this is not cool, or that's good looking, or that's quality, or that's elevated, or, people nowadays say that's aesthetic, but, people don't necessarily always know what aesthetic means. So again, aesthetics basically is the study of what is beautiful. And I'm asking the question, what is beautiful to you? And we know that we've been working on linear perspective and drawing and in three-dimensional forms and spaces and buildings. And we can begin to understand and appreciate the natural world and the environments we live in just a little bit more because we can draw them, or we can begin to draw them and understand how they were drawn. Now, we're taking a look at Claude Monet and his garden paintings. His personal aesthetic choices were made not only in the painting that we see, but in the actual garden itself. When he was growing older and had plenty of money, he decided that he wanted the gardens to be constructed to his specifications, and his choices were influenced by the culture in Paris at the time. His environment included music and food and all kinds of cultural things in Paris, and that influenced his choices, his aesthetic choices, and his personal experiences made an impact when he was deciding on this design for the gardens. Now, in Paris in the 1900s, they were experiencing an influence of many different cultures. In Japan, for example, print works were imported into Paris, and China, for example, had porcelain pottery that was brought to the European region, and African masks were being displayed in museums, and not to mention all of the classical art that has happened before in the Paris museums. The Industrial Revolution also influenced the large middle class that it created with its ability to buy new products that weren't available before. So, from China's porcelain to African masks to the Industrial Revolution, Paris had a large influence of a middle class that was pretty well educated, and that this then created the choices for artists like Claude Monet. So, the question I'm asking you to try and tackle is, how does your aesthetic choice get influenced by culture? What are those things in our environment that make our personal experiences different, and that basically ultimately create what we look like, what music we listen to, what choices in food we make, what cars we drive, or where we choose to spend our money, and what we consider beautiful? Okay, so you're going to answer the questions in the slides today, and we want to tie this into some of the language that we have been learning in the class, such as linear perspective, elements of art, principles of design, and we want to tie that into our own aesthetic choices. How does culture influence you? I'll tell you this. In my early years, I didn't think of aesthetics as a thing that I can choose. I was raised in a single parent household, and I think my aesthetic as a young kid was basically one of poverty, and I didn't know it. Um, which is great because, like, why would you want to know that you're living in poverty, right? But I I basically grew up in a household where my choices in clothing were sometimes going to the store and picking out my clothing. And that, happened maybe 3 times a year, where the rest of the time I was buying clothes from the thrift store or buying clothes that were hand me downs or whatnot, and shoes because I was skateboarding a lot. My aesthetic choices in shoes were basically like whatever I could get my hands on because I was skateboarding, I was ruining shoes all the time. So I would, even when I started working as a 16-year-old, I didn't buy Nike or Adidas or anything like that. I bought Payless shoes, which was basically like 99-cent store kind of shoes. And I would tear them up anyway. So my aesthetic in clothing was sometimes a little ripped, and even today I still see it in my the way that I dress is sometimes a little uh, chunk of little paint, a little stain, a little bit of rips, and a lot of jeans because it's what I could afford, and so I can consider my fashion style a sort of a thrifty, affordable, uh, just a young skater who didn't really care for fancy things. Not that I didn't care for fancy things, I just simply could not afford it, and so that was my aesthetic choice in fashion. I think my aesthetic choices in where I live, as far as houses or homes or whatever, has always been like jumping around from apartment to apartment with my mom and my brother as a younger person. And when I was old enough to move out, it was the same thing: more apartments and more, just affordable places to live. As I began to make a little more money, my aesthetic choices in architecture changed. And I started thinking, I want my own house. I want it to be a freestanding house. And I want it to be, much different than I was when I was growing up. But I didn't want to live in the city. I didn't want to live necessarily next to a giant building or some fancy place. I just wanted a house. So that's my aesthetic choice there. My aesthetic choice in paintings and artwork and things like this are influenced by a lot of the street art in general, but a lot of classical drawings, Da Vinci type stuff, and Michelangelo Renaissance kind of paintings, and a modern look at um, abstraction, but not just splattering paint around. That's not my thing. I think my aesthetic in paintings now is more industrial and dealing with metal and concrete, dealing with abstract but real as well, and very political type work, where I can see my choices are influenced by the news feeds. They're influenced by what I read every day, by economics, the way the society deals with money. I'm also influenced by the artworks that I've seen and visited in our local museums and galleries, and by my Chicano upraising of being Latino and speaking Spanish also shows up in the themes of the works that I choose to create and choose to enjoy.